Hello and welcome to a UK column interview. I'm Charles Mallet. I'm pleased today to be joined by Lord Deben, who has spent many years as a government minister, then known as John Gummer. Lord Deben, thank you very much indeed for joining me and welcome to UK column.
Thank you.
Now, I got in touch with you because you, over the years, have been a close personal friend of the recently deceased Mike Lynch, and in particular, you've spoken out about the extradition situation that he found himself subject to back in 2023 as a result of the Hewlett-Packard autonomy fraud case. What I'd like you to do, please, is just to explain to the audience your view of the situation as it unfolded.
Well, I was concerned about this before Mike Lynch was involved. It was an agreement between the British government under Tony Blair and the Americans, which was a one-way extradition system, which enabled the Americans to insist upon the extradition of individuals from Britain. But there was no reverse. We couldn't insist upon extradition from the United States. Now, the problem with this is not only that there is no reciprocity, it is that it could be used, and later, when it happened to Mike Lynch, was being used for commercial purposes. The American legal system is very different from our own. It has quite a number of elected judges and prosecutors, people who may have other interests. So it is always difficult to have a reciprocal arrangement, but to have one that doesn't allow us to get the benefits of being able to extradite people whom our courts need is, of course, unacceptable. But the trouble here is that Mike Lynch was the most important shareholder and the creator of a very successful software business. And he was hunted by Hewlett-Packard. He didn't go to them. They weren't in the business of selling it. But Hewlett-Packard came after them and offered them, after considerable due diligence, when everything was open to them, offered them a sum of money which was accepted. Indeed, it was accepted because the shareholders who were other than Mike, and he didn't have a majority of those shares, the shareholders thought this was an extremely good deal. It was done by a British firm under British law, and yet Hewlett-Packard decided that they would try to have the real trial in the United States. Now, this was after the British Serious Crime Unit, the fraud organization that we have, had investigated the claims of Hewlett-Packard and had said there was no case to answer. And then for year after year after year, Mike Lynch was living under the shadow of being extradited. And it was a shadow because I think it's true that 100% of people who are extradited would be found guilty in a commercial case like this. Indeed, well over 90% of people who are had up in this way in the United States are found guilty. Only North Korea has a more universal situation. So you will understand why he was very concerned about this. He was to be taken to a situation in which it was almost impossible for him to win. And the reason they have such a high proportion of success is because people are so frightened of losing that they do plea bargaining. It's a thing we don't know of in Britain, and it's really nothing to do with justice. What you do is to say, yes, I'm guilty, And you say that because they promise you 2 years in prison rather than 20 years in prison. Or they promise you a fine of $100,000 instead of $1 million, or whatever may be the deal. Deal always differs depending on the circumstances of the person concerned. Now, Mike was not prepared to do that. Mike was an honest, decent, straightforward man. His whole life had been spent in being, without doubt, probably the most remarkable figure in the software industry in the whole of Europe. Only in Silicon Valley could you find people who would compete with him in his abilities. And he wasn't going to say he was guilty because he knew he wasn't. Ultimately, the British came and, in a charmingly informal but still firm way, took him to the airport and accepted the extradition. Now, during all this time, people who knew the case were fighting it, not only in the courts, but in the public arena. And I, for example, raised it again and again in all sorts of ways. And I'm ashamed that Home Secretaries did not say, look, this is just not true. This is just not sensible. And it wasn't just because we felt strongly about Mike, although, of course, one's friendship mattered a lot. It was also because the Americans are already using their power to get advantage commercially. What they do is to threaten things like this so that people are afraid not to do what they want. They use it to extend American commercial interests. America pretends to be the great free enterprise economy, but of course it is one of the most protectionist economies there are. And it's protectionist in two ways. It uses all sorts of excuses to stop people buying businesses in the United States. You can't buy an airline, for example. You can't buy very large numbers of things because it's called national security. And if it's not that, you are told that you can't export into America for some kind of health reasons. So, for example, no one who grows lemons can export into the United States, into any state which is contiguous to a state that grows lemons. Now, what more protective and protectionist system could you have? So America uses its own internal laws and also its outstretch through tax and through every other way of using laws beyond its own rights to protect its businesses. Because in the end, it believes that somehow or other globalization is actually the extension of American hegemony. And so what has happened here is just one example of that. And many of us felt that using the extradition rules in order to cow businesses, which is what it was about, cowing the business. And Mike fought it. Now, I have to say, I had very little hope that he would win. Because with those sort of figures, plus 90%, how should he have won? And he won because the case was so clear, it was so clearly proved, and he was so clearly honorable and honest that the jury said that on no single one of the 14 counts Hewlett-Packard dug up, no one of them was he guilty. Now, the sad thing is that Hewlett-Packard, we understand, will try to proceed beyond the grave, if you can think of anything more unpleasant, or anything that further underlines what I've said about the way America uses these things. So I have three very simple desires. First of all, to get the law changed. we can't go on like this. This is not acceptable. We are a sovereign state, and we certainly didn't take back control by stupidly leaving the European Union. But the fact of the matter is, we do believe that we make our own decisions, and there is no position for a non-reciprocal arrangement with anybody. Secondly, there should be no provision with a system which plays into the American legal system, which just isn't like ours. And I'm saying that in the most delicate way, but it certainly isn't like ours. And the third thing is that I hope people will realize that Hewlett Packard is not a company with whom one wishes to deal, because it's clear that what really happened was that Hewlett Packard bought this company having sought it, as I say, not that it was offered to them, but that they wanted it, and then they mucked it up. And that, I'm afraid, is one of the problems with some kinds of businesses. They know they can't do it themselves, so they buy something, and then they impose on that business the ways which they run things. And very often those are the very reasons why they've not been able to do this themselves. And I fear, and I begin to sound rather anti-American, I'm not at all, but I fear that American companies are very often like that. Some are not. I've got a very good example where Molson Coors has bought a business near where I live, and it's been absolutely remarkable. It has recognized that it was a really good business. It has allowed it to continue as it was, but it has provided the money which was necessary for its expansion, which is exactly how you should deal with these things. But I'm afraid Hewlett Packard, in order to save the face of senior management, decided that they would pursue Mike Lynch in particular. Now, Mike Lynch had a few days, literally, of release and relief from his terrible ordeal. Just a few days, and was then drowned. I have to say that if I were running Hewlett Packard, I would understand perfectly well that this is the moment in which you remove yourself from this whole saga. And if they don't, then I, for one, will never buy anything from them.
Indeed, I think you've made your position clear on that, and I think there's a number of things to pick out from that sort of opening statement. Just to go back to the way in which the law could or should be changed. Of course, you're talking about the Extradition Act 2003, which was effectively crafted by the then Blair government. To what extent do you consider it the case that, in fact, the sort of 9 principles by which any situation should be judged were simply failed? And I think the two I'm really thinking of are excessive delay, because of course this took place 12 years after the deal had effectively gone through, and then also forum, in that if justice could be served by a trial in the United Kingdom, then it should have done. And so is it a case that the law should be done away with and reinvented, or simply that what is written down should actually be adhered to correctly?
Well, I don't think that this is a law between equals. And I think what you just said shows that. The truth is that when push came to shove, the British government was not prepared to enforce those 2 principles. And I fear that British governments very often aren't, because the Americans bring pressure to bear unconnected with this particular agreement. What they do is to remind Britain about the special relationship on military matters and all sorts of other things. They constantly use the strength of the mightiest country on earth, and people give way to them. So I fear that whatever you do to the act in order to make it more likely that governments will stand by those elements, the more that you have to doubt whether they will be brave enough. And so I come back to the matter of principle. I'm in favor of reciprocal arrangements for extradition. But they have to have two elements. First of all, they have to be reciprocal. And secondly, the rules have got to be of a sort that mean that neither side is prepared to lean on the other, because otherwise it will cease to be a reciprocal arrangement. In other words, you can keep things like those elements you raised if the United States knows that not only would we insist on it as far as our people are concerned, but we would insist on it in terms of our relationships with them. So they would then put themselves into a position in which they would have to use the same things when we ask for reciprocity this way. But you see, they wouldn't. We know they wouldn't. So my answer is no reciprocity, no agreement without reciprocity. We either both do it. Now, the awful thing is that the Americans said they couldn't give reciprocity because their constitution did not allow it. Well, what the blazes are we doing having reciprocity with a country that won't do it with us on the basis that their constitution, in order to protect the freedom of its people, doesn't allow it? Well, if their constitution doesn't allow it, our unwritten constitution shouldn't allow it.
Absolutely fair enough. And I think sort of beyond that, really, certainly from the way you've described the situation at the start, in actual fact, it looks much more like the levers really are being pulled by corporations rather than governments. So even if there were reciprocity, by what mechanism are corporate interests checked, as it were, within political sort of circles?
Well, the truth is that Britain has many failings, but in general, corporate interests are much less powerful here. And in America, corporate interests are much more powerful. And you see that very clearly. First of all, you see it in the way in which corporations engage in elections. Never be allowed to use your money in the way that Elon Musk is using his now in the American elections in the United Kingdom. And secondly, you know it when you see a company like ExxonMobil, which managed by using money to hold up the battle against climate change for some 20 years, even though its own scientists, and this is after all public knowledge, its own scientists had shown that climate change was happening and that it was the use of fossil fuels that were making it. For 20 years, they kept America from taking the steps that it ought to take, which is the reason that it's going to cost us a great deal more money, be very much more painful in order to battle for our own existence because of ExxonMobil. That is what happens in America. So the reciprocity becomes not only a lack of reciprocity with the government, but it means that we have a non-reciprocal arrangement with American big business who are very interested in protecting their own position.
And just to sort of go back towards Mike Lynch and what he became subsequently involved in, which was, at least from the funding point of view and advisory, Darktrace, which deals with cyber security in the AI dimension. Now, the setup and the continuing conduct of that company is very, very closely aligned with the intelligence and security architecture of the United Kingdom. How do you perceive that relationship in terms of its correctness, I suppose, for want of a better term?
Well, I am not as familiar with the post arrangements that I am with the ones we have been talking about. I merely say that Darktrace owes a huge amount to that brilliance that we've now lost. That the contribution to British economy, as well as security, that Mike Lynch as an individual made was absolutely outstanding. And even if we hadn't lost a friend, even if we hadn't lost somebody who was economically valuable to us, we've lost somebody who's led the British software industry and our understanding of modern technology in a way which no one else has. So we've lost somebody who made one of the biggest contributions to our nation of anybody in the last 30 years. So we ought to stand up for him. And the way in which he was treated by organizations like Darktrace ought to be looked at very carefully, because they owe everything to him, just as Hewlett-Packard could have owed a great deal to him if they'd known how to run that business.
Absolutely. Now, something that's rather more sensitive, but I think it must be asked. Given the circumstances that you've described, the backdrop to, and the situations surrounding the deaths of, first of all, Stephen Chamberlain, then Mike Lynch and associates aboard the Bayesian, coincidence, it must be said, does seem like the least plausible explanation. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, I have a view that says that fate sometimes deals the most amazing of blows. You really don't have to go very far into history to see the most amazing things happen. People avoid wars by a whip stitch, create wars by the tiniest of decisions. I think there is nothing to say that this is anything other than a coincidence, but it is a terrifying and terrible coincidence. And of course, it leaves deeply wounded people behind. And what an awful thing to happen to the daughter who had just got into Oxford, who had a beautiful future ahead of her, was a lovely girl, as well as somebody who had another 30 or maybe 40 years even of contribution to Britain. And those other people who were on that boat too, who were people who were making real contributions to life. I feel very deeply saddened, of course, for the death, but even more so for those who are now living and have to live with what has happened. But I think what happened was genuinely a coincidence.
And just to sort of tie that off, to what degree do you have confidence in any investigation into deaths on both sides of the both sides of the Mediterranean, I suppose I should say, but the UK and indeed the Sicilian investigation?
Oh, I see no reason to be other than sure of the British one, and I think the Italian one is probably likely to be perfect one. I have no reason to criticise that. I'm not somebody who goes around being suggesting that there are all sorts of hidden businesses at work. I know which ones are at work. This is why I quoted a number of them. Those are real, objective, proven things. I don't think we need to get into any kind of view of hidden hands to deal with this case. There are no hidden hands. I think there's the absolutely direct hand of American business determined to get what it wants at any cost of anybody. And that is not a thing that we should have in this world. And it's not a thing that Britain should be complicit in. And that is why I blame to Home Secretaries for not actually saying, no, not here. And particularly when we had had a case in Britain of someone prosecuted and found guilty of dangerous driving without due care, but I think dangerous driving, in fact, who managed just to sit in the United States and saying she wasn't coming here. We knew from an absolutely clear example, which had meant the death of a young man, we knew that this agreement was entirely one-sided and entirely unacceptable, and we should have used any opportunity to make sure that it didn't mean that Mike was exported to America to stand trial.
Absolutely. Now tell me then, with all this in mind, how do you push your campaign forward on the extradition front? What is your plan in the immediate future to deal with this?
Well, I'm hoping to liaise with David Davis in the House of Commons. He's been extremely good in the House of Commons. It's a thing that both houses will have to try to put together. We'll try to use as much of our efforts as possible. It's not going to be easy because the moment that a government thinks of doing it, then all those pressures are turned on them. I mean, after all, we went to war in Iraq when it should never have been, because a government feared saying to the United States, we won't. I've always honored those prime ministers who have stood up and said, no, we were saved, after all, from being at war in Vietnam because a British prime minister said no. And I voted myself against the war in Iraq. And it was quite clear that all that was happening was that Tony Blair was proposing something because it was what the Americans wanted. I think if he had said no, first of all, there would have been no parliamentary backing for it because his party would not have been whipped. I think if he'd said no, there might well never have been that war in Iraq, which was so disastrous and left us with a mess which we're still having to clear up.
Absolutely.
So we have to be willing to be independent.
And now we are, though, a generation away from that time, with the whiff of conscription and talk about national service in the air, with the apparently looming threat from either Russia or Iran or goodness knows where else. Do you see that there is a realistic chance of becoming involved within kinetic action in the next couple of years?
Well, I think one of the problems that we've now got is that we have a situation in which if the American election goes one way, then the United States will be saying things which are quite inimical to a proper association between us in Europe and them. It seems to be perfectly reasonable for putative presidents to talk about the world in a way which we would not be able to because of our relationship with the United States. So I think we're in a very difficult position at the moment. Let's put it at the very least thing. We're in a very difficult position, and we must hope that the United States does recognize how important it is not to go down the false ways of pretending that that the battle in the Ukraine isn't a battle for freedom of all of us, pretending that climate change isn't happening and therefore you don't have to do anything about it, pretending that you can have a relationship with Russia which condones their manifestly militaristic and imperialist intentions. That is an impossible position, it seems to me, for the United States to take up, and yet there is one candidate who seems to think that that's how it should go forward. So we must pray that that doesn't happen.
Yes, I mean, I think we'd all be encouraged if there was greater effort going into talks of or the pursuit of peace, but we seem to be where we are at the moment. Now, just we're sort of closing down in terms of time, but what I do want to just deal with, because you've now referred to it a couple of times, and of course, until last year, you were the chairman of the Climate Change Committee. It is still, despite the sort of prevalent narrative, it is still a contentious topic, and I think particularly the fundamental underpinning of particularly the pursuit of what's called net zero, and indeed the focus on emissions of carbon dioxide. So what I would ask is how do you explain the proposition that approximately 3% of overall emissions of carbon dioxide, which are anthropogenic, can affect the climate in such a way that 97% of biogenic emissions seem not to be able to?
Well, it's very fact. First of all, I don't say that. That's what almost every scientist in the world, every single major scientific institution says. That's the first thing. Secondly, historically, we can go back 1,000,000 years into the ice, and you can see that there has never been a time in which the temperature has risen as fast since as it has in the last 150, 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. So first of all, this is a non-analogous situation. Thirdly, if you think about how it is we know that the Earth became cool enough for, first of all, reptiles, then mammals, then human beings to emerge, it was because the bushes and trees that also emerged earlier on took out of the atmosphere carbon and laid that carbon down as they died in what became, over the millennia, oil, coal, and gas. No one at all denies that. If you then use that and put it back into the atmosphere, it wouldn't be surprising, would it, if the atmosphere heats up, given that it got cool when you took it out. So thirdly, it is quite clear from our scientific understanding of history that this is happening. And the fact of the matter is, no serious scientist now denies climate change. And as you look across the world and see the effect of climate change, and you know it never happened before, except when we put this carbon into the atmosphere, then you'd be frankly absolutely ridiculous to suggest anything other than this. There is no evidence that counteracts the fact that we are creating climate change. We have to stop doing it. And when we do, we will take a long time to reverse the damage that we're doing. And the terrible thing is that we who have grown rich from what we've done are giving some of the poorest people on earth lives which are intolerable because of what we're doing. So there is a battle that's on, and I shall go on fighting that battle till my dying day, because I've got 10 grandchildren, and the sort of world we're leaving them is a world in which they will find it very difficult to live. And those who suggest that we should not take these steps are the people who are really betraying us. And I've just finished, while they're talking about, a wonderful comment once, which was made to one of these major deniers by Tristan Garel-Jones, a minister. He said, look, if those who deny climate change are right, all we've done is to clean up the atmosphere. If they're wrong, we've buggered up the future. There's no doubt about where the precautionary principle takes us, but we don't need to do it because of the precautionary principle. We should do it because of the facts.
Yes, I mean, I would have to agree to disagree, and certainly I would push back on the assertion that all scientists believe the same thing.
Well, 97% of those who are qualified support what I have said. I'm sorry, you can't say that and be taken seriously. You really can't. I'm not prepared to say this is not a sensible position when the head of every single scientific equivalent to the Royal Society says one thing. You are not in a position to say the opposite and be taken seriously. You can't be taken seriously. And if your organization doesn't see that, then you join the group of people who only don't take it seriously because it's inconvenient. There is no case that you've got. There's nothing else in science that is as sure as this. So really, don't expect to be taken seriously.
Well, I think I will still continue
Well, I'm
expect
very
that.
sorry. I mean, it's like it's about a serious position of suggesting, well, something much as that the Haitians were eating pet dogs which they were stealing. You've got yourself into that position if you're saying that. You really do. I mean, it's just not a sensible position to be in.
But the fundamental question of how a 3% contribution outweighs that of a 97% contribution to emissions is something that I haven't really heard satisfactorily resolved.
Well, you can go to any scientist who is a climatologist, and they'll go through it with you. The fact that you are not a scientist of any of that amount, and you say that, as it's another of the excuses. It's the one they use. Each one by one, they are destroyed. This one has been destroyed. I don't want to go through the total details of it because we'd be here for about 2 hours. But the fact of the matter is, no serious scientist supports what you've said. And therefore, look, no, in the end, you have to look for the best advice. And if I want to mend a motor car, I do not ask somebody who sells newspapers or cleans houses or is an expert on archaeology to tell me how to mend a motor car. If I want to find out about climatology, the climate, I ask people who are experts in the climate. I know of no respectable expert in the climate who will support you.
For technical reasons beyond the control of either of us, the connection with Lord Deben was lost at that point. And I must make it very clear that it certainly had absolutely nothing to do with the divergence of views towards the end of the conversation. So it just remains for me to thank you, the audience, very much for joining me, and also thank you to Lord Deben very much for a frank exchange of views and certainly a terrific insight into the state of play with regard to extradition and in particular the relationship with the United States and indeed the wider corporate interests and influences. There will be notes posted alongside this interview with links at ukcolumn.org. Thank you very much for watching.